Welcome to another GED reading lesson. This time we're talking about the topic of connotation. You've probably heard the phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, I propose to you that one word is worth 1,000 pictures. So before we get started, I've got a fun little warm-up. It's just a little mental exercise. Like I said, it's fun. So I strongly encourage, wherever you are, go ahead and do this exercise in your head. It's really easy. I'm going to give you a word. You say out loud or say to yourself, or you can even write down the first word that comes into your mind when you see or hear the word I give you. All right, so super easy. There's no such thing as a wrong answer. It's just a fun little mental exercise. All right, here's your first word, young. What's the first word that pops into your mind? For a lot of people, the first word that pops in their mind is an opposite, so they think old immediately. Here's your next word, ocean. So maybe a word that pops into your head here is another body of water, like a lake. Or maybe you think of the name of a specific ocean, like the Atlantic or the Pacific. For me, I see this word, I immediately think of fish. Free. What comes in your mind when you see and hear the word free? I immediately think of the phrase and fair, like free and fair, because you hear that phrase a lot, especially recently. Monday. Some people immediately think of another day of the week, or some people think of a word that relates to how they feel about Mondays. I always think of coffee immediately when I see the word Monday, and then the very next thing in my head is Garfield. I grew up looking at that comic strip all the time, and Garfield the cat hates Mondays, and he always has to drink a lot of coffee to get through Mondays. Moist. I know, some people cannot stand this word. They hate it so much. They think it sounds terrible. I've never understood that personally. But regardless of your personal feelings, what comes in your head when you see the word moist? I do a lot of cooking and baking, so I see moist and I immediately think of a cake. Because when you make a cake, you want to have a nice moist texture. All right, last one, ring. What comes in your head when you see ring? Maybe you think of like an engagement ring. Maybe you think of a song related to rings, like All the Single Ladies. I see ring and my head immediately goes telephone. All right, so fun little exercise, right? Let's do a second little exercise. This is very similar, really easy, no wrong answer. So I'm going to give you an image on the screen. And from looking at that image, what film, book, play, story, song, myth, etc. do you think of when you first see it? So basically, anything with a story or a narrative to it, instead of thinking of the next word that pops in your head. All right, so here's your first one. I have here an apple on your screen. What do you immediately think of in terms of a film, book, play, story, song, etc.? For me, the first one that pops in my head, I used to work as a librarian, and so I shelved the Twilight books quite often. They were very popular, so I think of Twilight. I've done this before with a class, and several students thought of the story of Adam and Eve. All right, here's your next image. Got a sword here. I've had some students think of Game of Thrones. I immediately think of the sword and the stone. Maybe you think of King Arthur, the Arthurian legends. Here's your next one. Now, this one, every time I've used this lesson in a class, a whole bunch of students always think of the Narnia books. So like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when they see the lion. Maybe you thought of a different one. And we'll finish with this image of this cool yellow sports car. For me, I immediately think of Transformers because it makes me think of Bumblebee, even though it's not exactly like Bumblebee. All right, so fun little mental exercise just to get things percolating, get the wheels turning. Let's segue into our lesson now. So, we're talking connotation today, and the exercises that we did relate to connotation. So, denotation is the dictionary definition of something, right? Connotation is these extra layers of meaning that something can have. Something can have more than one meaning, and it can have more than one meaning depending on the context, depending on who's using the word. There's a lot of rules and nuance behind connotation. So, first of all, what's the purpose of connotation in writing? It gives an extra layer of meaning to a writer's words. Enables a writer to say more while writing less. If you've ever read anything by Ernest Hemingway, sorry, I personally hate his books. But if you've ever read Ernest Hemingway, one of his big things was trying to say as much with as few words as possible. So he depended heavily on connotation. Connotation makes a story or a poem or other form of literature richer and fuller for the reader, because there's these extra layers of meaning that a reader can think about when they're reading it. Connotation can be used really effectively in satire or other forms of social commentary because it communicates an extra secret meaning to select readers who are like-minded with the author, or readers who have a common vocabulary that they use. So the writer can say things that don't offend the masses. Maybe the writer is opposed to something that a lot of people like. So other people that are opposed to that idea all tend to use common words and phrases and have some common ideas. They can write about and react to this thing without everybody else that likes the thing figuring out what they're saying. It's also a way to avoid getting into trouble with authorities. I'm going to give you a great example at the end of this lesson. So keep that thought in the back of your head. And it also allows a writer to say something that will only be understood by readers with whom the author shares an understanding or a worldview, etc. Again, I'm going to give you an example of this done on an awesome level at the end of this lesson. So, some other things to be aware of about connotation. Connotation can exist in a specific word choice itself. So typically when we're talking about adjective, one word may have the same dictionary meaning as another, which again is denotation, but the reader infers an extra meaning from the specific word chosen. It means the reader assumes or sees an extra meaning. The writer knows that the reader will infer this meaning. They want the reader to do that. Like, let's say you're reading a post on Reddit and the OP writes about a Karen in their neighborhood. Karen on its surface is just a woman's name, but it also has a different layer of meaning that we in society understand, particularly at this time in history. So if you read that there's a Karen in the neighborhood, you automatically know quite a bit about this woman, even though the writer has only said one word about this person. All right. Also, some words have a double meaning, like a double entendre, where you make kind of a not necessarily safe for work joke about something. Like any number of objects sometimes are used to represent male body parts or female body parts. Typically with nouns, the word could have an additional cultural meaning that's known to the reader. So for example, if you were reading a story that has an Asian background to it, many Asian cultures use chopsticks, and there are certain rules of etiquette governing chopsticks. And there's also history behind those. So if the author uses chopsticks in a particular way, that would give an extra layer of meaning to the readers that understand about this part of culture. Someone who doesn't really know about Asian cultures might not understand that layer of meaning, but they're not really the target audience either. Connotation can exist in a character or a place name as well. There's often a backstory or a history or a cultural meaning in a name that a writer wants the reader to infer. So again, the writer is trying to lead you to make certain educated guesses or conclusions without having to write more. That extra layer of meaning gives more to the story or to a specific character. So like here in Alabama, there is a connotation behind various place names. Like if I'm writing about the civil rights era and I reference Birmingham, there's a whole lot of history with Birmingham connected to civil rights. For starters, the Birmingham church bombing. And there were many, many, many protests in Birmingham. So there's all kinds of historical meaning that a reader would know about if I reference Birmingham in that context. Or to give another example, here in Alabama, if someone says, well, that's just the Walker County in me coming out, there's a whole layer of meaning in that reference to Walker County. Now, as someone who's not originally from Alabama, when I first moved here, I would hear people make jokes about Walker County, and I had no idea what this was all about. That's because there's connotation. There's backstory and cultural meaning to that specific county that I, as an outsider, didn't know about, but the people talking about it, the insiders, did know. All right? So, some other things to know about connotation. It can exist within a phrase. So a particular phrase can lead the reader to infer additional backstory, history, cultural meaning, etc. Certain phrases have had certain historical significance. Like, don't tread on me. That has a whole history in the United States. Or sometimes phrases are important within a story. So, like if you followed Battlestar Galactica, fantastic sci-fi show. The phrase, so say we all, is significant within that world. If you've watched several of the episodes, you gain an understanding of the nuance that this phrase has and the deeper meaning. And so when a character says, so say we all, you get a particular feeling as you're watching once you're an insider who understands it. And it makes a scene more powerful. Connotation can exist in a type of item. So the brand might have additional meaning to a reader. If you're writing a story or reading a story that's set in the 1990s, and there's a boy, let's say a 10 or 11-year-old boy in the story set in the 90s, and he asks his parents to buy him a pair of Reeboks. Now, Reeboks, they're just a brand of shoes, but there's some additional meaning there. If you grew up in the 90s or know very much about the 90s, you would know that for a period of time, Reeboks were the shoe that you needed to have. They were the hot, popular shoe. There was a whole cultural acceptance you would get at school if you had the specific brand. Or, today, if you're describing a character and the character has all the latest Apple products, that choice on part of the character with that specific brand could have additional meaning to a reader. It could tell them more about what matters to this character. The specific item itself might have additional meaning, like an apple or a pencil. Sometimes specific examples mentioned might imply something. There are 3 elements of connotative meaning. So there are shades of meaning. For example, you want to say that the weather is hot. But instead of saying exactly how many degrees it is, instead of saying, it's 90 degrees out, you could say the air is baking, stifling, sweltering, equatorial, scorching, sizzling, boiling, or burning. These are all shades of meaning. They're different layers of how hot it is. And they mean all the same thing in a dictionary, but they actually have connotative meaning. If I say that it's sweltering outside, sweltering has a slightly different meaning than just hot. It's a whole nother level of hot. Positive or negative associations. So the word passionate has the same denotative or dictionary meaning as the word zealous, but the words have completely opposite connotative meanings. So passionate and zealous, they both mean someone that cares deeply about something or feels strongly about it. But passionate is positive and zealous is negative. So if you write about a young man being passionate, that means that he's really excited about something that he's interested in. And generally we would think of that as a good thing. But if you say that he's zealous, it gives the idea that he spends all of his time trying to forcibly convert other people into feeling the same way about this thing that he does. To give you another example, this was a foreign student I had who was writing a paper. So English was the student's second language. And he was writing a paper about Martin Luther, the reformer who split from the Catholic Church. Now, he wanted to use a word that meant loving. And he was referring to Martin Luther's love for, I believe, either truth or God. I can't remember anymore. It's been so long since I read the paper. But a very innocent context, and he wants to use a word that means loving. So the student is also trying to strengthen his English. He wants to try out some higher vocabulary. So he apparently went to the thesaurus and he picked out what he thought was a nice, big, appealing word that would make him sound more educated in his paper. And unfortunately, the word he picked was amorous. So sadly, that takes a whole different layer of meaning because amorous refers to sexual love. And in the context, it not only made no sense, it completely changed the meaning of this entire section of his paper. It was hilarious. I had a really good laugh over it, and then I felt really bad for the student. And of course, the poor guy was quite embarrassed when I had to explain his mistake to him. But that's a great example of how a word can have different meanings, even though the dictionary meaning is the same. Personal interpretation. So dark means the absence of light. That's the denotative or the dictionary meaning. But dark has different connotations. It has a connotation of fear, mystery, suspense, confusion, nighttime, gloom, shadows, etc., depending on a person's personal interaction with the word. For some people, dark could actually have positive connotation. For other people, for most people, I would argue, there's more of a negative connotation. And so the personal interpretation of the reader also plays into connotation. So I'm going to show you some phrases where I changed the word to a word that has the same dictionary meaning, but has a different connotative meaning. And I want you to think about the change in the mental image that you get, all right? So if I say a skinny woman versus a slim woman, the word skinny and the word slim, they basically mean the same thing, but skinny has a negative connotation, slim has a positive. So if I refer to a skinny woman, it's actually rather critical of her physique. If I refer to a slim woman, it's positive. A clever girl versus a cunning girl. So they both mean smart, but a clever girl is a girl who is using her knowledge in an innovative way. A Cunning girl, she's probably dishonest. She's using her knowledge to benefit herself and probably harm others. A confident student versus a cocky student. So, a confident person, that's a positive. Cocky means they're arrogant. A young boy versus a childish boy. See, here again, one is positive, one is negative. All right, let's compare two passages. So here's our first passage. James opened the kitchen door. The aroma of stew wafted in the air. As a curious James peered into the simmering ragout, he could see the slender carrots he had grown this fall. Would you say that passage is positive or negative? Just in your head, what do you think? All right. Look at it and see, are there any specific words that lead you to believe the passage is positive or negative? All right, let's look at the other passages and we'll talk more. Verses. James flung open the kitchen door. The odor of stew hung in the air. As a nosy James glared into the roiling concoction, he could see the scrawny carrots he had grown this fall. All right, so in terms of dictionary definition, the two passages use words with the same meaning, but the connotation is quite different. So which passage would you say is positive? Hopefully you picked passage number 1, which leaves us passage number 2 as being our negative example. All right, what specific words gave it away for you? Typically, when I do this lesson in a classroom, most students will mention the word aroma to them has a positive connotation. Because aroma usually is used when a smell is pleasing to us. And that word wafted in the air, that's another one that students will often mention. Because that wafted, it's got that idea of lightly hanging in the air. Now, instead, in the second passage, it uses that word odor, and that's the word that most students will point to as showing you that the second passage is negative, because odor is a word you use for a smell that you don't like. Another phrase, actually, 2-word phrase that students will point to as negative is roiling concoction. There's a big difference between simmering ragout and roiling concoction. They're both describing stew, but which of those stews do you actually want to eat? Probably not the second one. All right, so I'm going to show you a few things. I want you to figure out what's the meaning. Observe on your own how vastly different a sentence becomes just by choosing a different word with the same basic dictionary meaning. Susie's uncle gave her shoulder an affectionate squeeze. Versus Susie's uncle gave her shoulder an amorous squeeze. You notice how in the first example, Susie's uncle sounds okay as an uncle. Second example, Susie's uncle's a very, very bad uncle. Creepy uncle. What about, what does a speaker actually mean when they say, Dylan is such a special boy? Well, this one could actually go a couple of directions. It could be positive. Sometimes people use special in a positive context, but a lot of times we use the word special when we're actually being quite negative. We use it, the dictionary definition is positive, and the connotative definition can actually be quite negative based on the context. If I asked you how a date went and you said, oh, he was special, let me tell you, that indicates the guy was probably really creepy or weird. If you were writing an advertisement for a brand new product, would you call it newfangled or cutting edge to attract potential buyers? Well, one of those words sounds kind of like an old person trying to talk like how they think the young people talk, and the other sounds, more of a modern phrase. If you call something newfangled, you get a picture of like a very old person trying to describe the internet. Cutting edge has more of that chic, modern idea. All right, what's the connotative meaning here? I offer for you this picture of me at age 4. When I was a little girl, if I misbehaved in a restaurant, my mother would ask me, and I got asked this question a lot, let me tell you, do we need to go to the bathroom? And typically it would be phrased, do we need to go to the bathroom, young lady? Was my mother actually concerned about whether my bladder was full? No, right? The implied or connotative meaning to that sentence was you're misbehaving, and if we go to that bathroom, only one of us is going to come out happy. The connotative meaning was I was being threatened with a spanking. How about guy shows up for a very first date with a woman he met online and he brings her 3 red roses? Is that appropriate on the first date? Well, probably not, because red roses have a connotative meaning, right? Red roses mean love. And specifically, if you give 3 red roses, it means I love you. So maybe not, an appropriate thing to give on a first date. Now, maybe it was love at first sight, but, it might also scare the girl off. How about in this example? Is that okay with you? He asked. Fine, she said. Is it actually fine with her? Here's one that trapped a friend of mine who teaches high school. We're going to Netflix and chill. So my friend, who's a teacher, she was talking to her high schoolers, and she'd heard this phrase, Netflix and chill, and she didn't know that it had a different meaning. She thought it just literally meant hang out and literally watch Netflix. So when her students asked her what she was planning to do that weekend, she said that she and another friend were going to Netflix and chill. Now, this brought great delight to her students, who of course thought something very, very different was going to take place that weekend. How about at a wedding? What's the connotative meaning if the mother-in-law or the mother of the bride, or really any guest, shows up wearing white? Well, in the United States, that's severe disrespect to the bride. I mean, it's like the number 1 wedding etiquette rule. No one wears white except the bride. So there's a whole layer of meaning if a character shows up in a white dress. Here's one. This is a cultural one. Do you know what it means if you give someone a pear? So this is another true story. While I lived in China, I lived there for 4 years, I went to a couple of Chinese weddings. And the very first Chinese wedding I went to, I wanted to bring a gift for the bride because she was a friend of mine. And I know that Chinese people will frequently give each other fruit as a gift. It's considered a nice thing to do. So I decided to bring her a gift of some pears, like really nice, pretty pears, because pears are quite popular in China. People love them. And they have really good pears too. So I bring this gift of pears, and there were some looks of genuine horror when people saw my gift. Now, the bride fortunately knew that I was a poor, dumb American who didn't know better, so fortunately she didn't take offense. But she did have to take me aside and explain that I gave like the number 1 gift you do not give at a Chinese wedding. So what's wrong with pears? Well, the Chinese word for pear, li, is the same word or character that's used in the word for divorce. It's not the exact same character when you write it, but when you say it, it sounds the same. So literally giving pears at a wedding is kind of like saying you hope the couple divorce. Oops. Now, this is another true story. This happened to me in Korea. So I was teaching elementary students, and in particular, this was a 3rd grade class, really sweet kids, and they had taken a quiz. Well, a couple of the kids forgot to write their names on their quizzes, and I was busy grading, so I had my red pen. And so I wrote the students' names on their papers as soon as I recognized their handwriting. And I wrote their names in red pen because that's the pen that was in my hand. I gave the papers back to the children, and the ones with their names in red started crying. So, what's the difference between writing Jessica's name in black versus Jessica's name in red? Well, in Korean culture, as well as several other cultures, several other Asian cultures, and even a few other cultures around the world, writing someone's name in red was actually a way of cursing someone. In some cultures, it was literally a death curse. So I basically cursed these really sweet little 8-year-olds. Oops. What's in a name? In today's pop culture, what does it mean if someone is referred to as a Becky or Felicia? What does it mean if someone's called a Karen, to reference an example I gave earlier? There's cultural meaning behind those names, right? Let's say a character is named Lilith. Someone calls her Lil, and immediately she corrects them. Lilith. What does this lead you to infer about the character? Well, maybe you assume the character's a little bit uptight because they don't want their name shortened. Can you think of another example of a name that has kind of a connotative meaning? I was trying to think of any men's names that have that, and I was thinking Chad and Kevin kind of have a particular feel to them when you use those names. Now, connotation can change. As time passes, as history moves on, sometimes meaning changes. And it means that when you read something that's older, you might not get the full meaning that an audience from that time period would get. So to give an example, I love Jane Austen novels. You may or may not be familiar with any of her novels, but Jane Austen wrote in the early 1800s. So she will sometimes refer to a character going to town or say, he went to town. The thing is, to a modern audience, that probably just literally means that they went into a nearby town. But in Jane Austen's day, it didn't. It specifically meant that you went to London. So this can lead to a little bit of confusion because in some books from Jane Austen's time, people will use that phrase, and I can't recall the title of the book I was reading, but it referred to a character needing to go to town, and they were going to be gone for several days. Now, my understanding at the time that I read that book is that they're just going into the nearby town that's like a mile away. And so I was thinking, why is this trip going to take you multiple days? Because that's not where they were going. They were going literally to London, and London would actually be several hours' journey by horse at that time. So yeah, they're going to take a few days. But think about if you use that phrase today. Let's say a mother says to her toddler, "Wow, you really went to town with that purple crayon." Does she mean that he took the purple crayon to London? No. Connotation has changed over time, and it's also changed over culture. And so if you say someone went to town with something today, what it means is that they kind of went a little crazy with it. This toddler, maybe he not only colored his paper with purple crayon, but also the table, the wall, himself. In the early 90s, so think back to like 90, 91, 92, if a character said that a party was a bomb, and it's very important, a bomb, the article matters. Well, some of you probably immediately thought it means it was a good party. No, in the very early 90s, if you said something was a bomb, it meant it was a failure, it was awful. But in the mid-late 90s, if you said a party was da bomb, again, that article matters, da bomb means it was cool, it was hopping. What about calling someone the goat? In the past, if you referred to someone as a goat, they'd probably take offense at it. But today, if you say someone is the goat as opposed to a goat, the goat means greatest of all time. So yeah, if you previously called someone a goat, then you're probably, if it's a man, maybe commenting about what their face looks like or calling them old and ornery. So let's do a little bit of further practice. I'm going to show you some passages and we'll answer some questions that follow. When Antonio met Jennifer, he found her honesty refreshing. He had never met anyone who could be so candid, even when it might be easier to lie. Once Antonio wore a shirt Jennifer didn't like. "You look like a clown," she said with a laugh. Another day, Antonio asked Jennifer if she thought that Tiana might be interested in him. "Not a chance," she replied with her usual frankness. Then one day, when they were out with their friends, Antonio sprinkled too much garlic on his pizza. Again, Jennifer's criticism was straightforward. "Someone give this guy a breath mint," she exclaimed. That's when Antonio realized that being blunt was overrated. So, my question for you, how does the connotation of blunt differ from synonyms of that same word used in the passage? So here's the passage again, and I've highlighted all these words that basically have the same dictionary meaning. So honesty, candid, frankness, straightforward, blunt. How does the meaning change? Candid and blunt, they both mean honest, but see, candid's rather positive. Blunt is negative. You can see by the end of the passage, Antonio no longer likes Jennifer's honesty. Here's another passage. "Are you waiting for a new breakfast food that's more than just a cereal? Your wait is over. Verve is a new morning meal that sounds great and is easy to prepare. Verve was created with cutting-edge science to ensure you get all the healthy vitamins and minerals you need to get your day started. But unlike most healthy cereals, the taste of Verve is exceptional. Verve is not only flavorful, it is made from the best whole grains and protein available on the world market. Whole grains and brown rice give Verve its crunchy, crisp texture." I have to say the name that way because it's got an exclamation. I'm just following the rules. "Then we added nature's sugar, coconut milk, and blended it with dark, robust cinnamon from Asia. The blend of flavors and textures is something you will not forget. Verve is easy and convenient. Its bold, all-natural taste will get you going on the right foot. So be adventuresome. Add some energy to your morning. Add Verve. You'll be delighted you did." All right, so first question. What's the connotation of the word dark in the passage? So to go back to the passage, here's the passage. And dark, robust cinnamon from Asia in the second paragraph. So what's the connotation of dark? Is it meant to mean murky, somber, deep and rich, not light in color? And again, here's that word. Dark, robust cinnamon from Asia. Is it meant to mean murky, somber, deep and rich, or not light in color? Deep and rich, because they're using dark to make that cinnamon sound really appealing. The author uses words with positive connotations because people who eat cereal are healthier and happier. The author wants people to buy the cereal. It's the only cereal the author eats, or every cereal tastes delicious. Think back to that passage. Why do you think the author is using positive connotations? If you said B, you're correct. The author wants people to buy the cereal. All right, so remember at the beginning, I said I had an awesome example of a writer using connotation. I'm going to show you that. Sometimes connotation serves a much deeper purpose. So, Langston Hughes was a brilliant poet from the Harlem Renaissance. Specifically, he's a Black poet. And again, a brilliant, brilliant poet. And one of the things that's remarkable about Langston Hughes is that even though he was a Black poet at a time when Black poetry was less acceptable to mainstream audiences, Langston Hughes was appreciated by white audiences as well as by black audiences. The reason is because of how clever he was as a writer. So this is one of his most famous poems. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? So this poem, Dream Deferred, you may have seen this poem before or heard it referenced. Again, it's probably his most famous poem. It shows up on tote bags. People love this poem. Actually, it was one of my favorite poems for years. Well, still is, honestly. But there is a connotative meaning to this poem. So on the surface, to a white audience, this poem literally seems to be about deferring your dream, having to put off a dream. You have to wait for something that you want. Like, let's say your dream is going to college and you're not able to do it when you would like to do it. You have to keep waiting. So what happens to that dream? Does it dry up? Does it fester? Does it stink? Does it eventually explode? Do you have some sort of breakdown because you haven't achieved this dream? So on the surface, one of the reasons people love this poem is because they will tend to apply it to any dream that they have in their lives. It seems very personally applicable to a white audience. But you see, at the time that Langston Hughes wrote this poem, a black audience would have a very different take on it because there was connotative meaning that a white audience did not understand. Now, to help you get at what that meaning is, I'm going to show you another thing. So, Billie Holiday was a brilliant blues singer. I'm not going to play the song because I don't want to make YouTube mad, but do look up the song Strange Fruit. It's a great song. This song is actually referencing something that A Dream Deferred is referencing. So this song, Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scent of magnolia sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Now, what is that song Strange Fruit actually about? Is it about an actual type of fruit? No, not at all. See, this song is using connotative meaning. This song is actually about lynching. So it's about black people being strung up and hanged from trees, which was a significant problem specifically in the South, and actually still happens sometimes. So, Strange Fruit about lynching. Now look back at the Langston Hughes poem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So, like I said, a white audience would have taken this poem and understood it to be about just dreams, not getting what you're dreaming of, having to wait, maybe having to wait to buy a home, to go to college, to get married. But a black audience at the time this poem was written had a very different understanding. Now, first of all, when they saw that phrase dream or a dream deferred, they weren't thinking of the same dreams that a white audience was thinking of. They were thinking of that dream of equal rights, specifically freedom from the Jim Crow laws, the ability to have equal voting rights. That was the dream deferred. So to a white audience, it's a general term. To a black audience, it's very specific, connotative meaning there. But then when you get into the poem and what it's describing, it's not talking about what happens to our dreams. It's describing a body that's been lynched and what happens to that body, the process as it breaks down. And it's using that as the image to describe what happens as we continue to wait for equal rights. What's happening to us, what's happening to our society. See how that is such a brilliant example of using connotation to write a poem that society in general thinks is a wonderful poem, but a specific audience, the intended audience of the poem, takes a whole different set of meaning from this poem. They understand what it's really about, and it's quite empowering. But it doesn't get Langston Hughes into trouble. And like I said, that is one of the best examples I've ever seen of how to use connotation effectively. So I hope this lesson has been useful to you. Hope you've learned something. Stay tuned for the next lesson.